by translators without an actual definition or systematic description of the model. And now we come to the PACTE model. The PACTE group has been working on this model since the early 2000s, late 1990s. And the ultimate aim of this research was to actually improve the teaching and training of translators, the design of curriculum, the assessment of translation competence and proficiency in translation programs. So I share this view. I think that the translation competence model that they have proposed and the difference of skills they provides an excellent framework for the training of translators for both from the point of view of the trainer when it comes to designing curriculum, designing activities, designing assignments to writing, learning outcomes, etc. And also from the point of view of the trainee, because it will accelerate the training of an otherwise extremely difficult skill to master of translating. Good. So this is in this slide you see in these boxes the different what they call sub-competencies or sub-skills, the different components, pieces of the PACTE model, of seen as a set, as you can see from the arrows, interconnected sub-competencies, all of them together constitute what they call translation competence. So if we start with one of these boxes, where you see we start with the upper box, bilingual sub-competence. This knowledge they describe as procedural knowledge. It implies performance, an action, the execution of routines, and it has to do with the ability to communicate in two languages. So those who possess this bilingual sub-competence are able to master the interference between the two languages when this is not needed. So there are no interference. They are able to hedge or differentiate between the two languages. And it includes certain dimensions. One of them is the pragmatic dimension. The second one on the list is the social-linguistic dimension, and also the textual, which they add grammatical and lexical knowledge, obviously in the two languages. So when it comes to pragmatic knowledge, they refer to this pragmatic knowledge as the mastery and familiarity with conventions, practical conventions having to do with the use of language in accordance with certain contexts. We use language to express and understand linguistic functions. We want to persuade, we want to, that's the appellative function, we want to inform, provide information that's informative or function, or we want to express emotions. So depending on the context, we use language structures which match those contexts and the aims of communication. When it has to do with the social-linguistic knowledge, this involves knowledge of the social-linguistic conventions that we need to actually engage in language acts that are acceptable in a given context. So we use, for instance, language register. We use formal or informal language depending on the needs of communication, the context of communication, the situation, and the nature of the interlocutors. We are able to move from formal to informal. It also involves the use of dialect. Depending on the geographical, social, or temporal needs, we are able to use different varieties of the two languages. These are the dialects or dialectal variation. When it comes to text, translators need to master how texts work. Translators deal with texts, that is, with language in use for a specific need in a specific context. Therefore, we need to make sure that we master the knowledge required of how texts work. Aspects such as coherence, cohesion mechanisms, what holds a text together, and and the different textual genres that are used in different professional and lay communication situations, like contracts, literature, the novel, essays, poems, different types of texts that need to conform to certain conventions and expectations in order to work in different situations. So all of these is included by the PACTE group in the bilingual subcompetence. The second subcompetence is what they call extra-linguistic subcompetence. It has to do with knowledge. In this case, also they refer to it as declarative knowledge that we are able to relay or to express or to remember or to recollect. That has to do both implicitly and explicitly with the world in general and specific areas of specialization. They include, or they list, Amparo Hurtado does, and the PACTE group by extension, they include under this rubric of extra-linguistic competence what they call bicultural knowledge. That's the knowledge of the cultures related to the source and target cultures or the source and target languages. The second rubric they include in this under this extra-linguistic competence is what they call encyclopedic knowledge. Translators need to know about the world in general. They need a certain level of culture, of education, and they need to know, they have to possess this general knowledge of the world. And then they also need to couple that with the third component, which they term subject knowledge. That's field-specific knowledge. They need to know about law, they need to know about finance, they need to know about economics, they need to know about medicine, the different branches of knowledge where texts are being used for communication, mainly professional communication. So this is extra-linguistic subcompetence. You will agree to this point as advanced translation students that we need to know about the subject matter in addition to knowing about the language being used to speak or to talk or to write about this subject matter. Excellent. So we have the strategic subcompetence in the center. They refer to strategic subcompetence as the competence that will, let me see, yes, they call it procedural knowledge. Again, we execute certain routines with this knowledge. We do things with it. That's why it's called procedural by the PACTE group. And in this case, and I quote, this knowledge allows us to, or helps us to guarantee the efficiency of the translation process and the solving of problems that we encounter as translators. So this is the competence, the subcompetence that allows us to solve problems and identify problems while we translate. Some of the examples or elements that are included are, for instance, one, the ability to plan the process of translation and then execute its translation project, selecting, for instance, the most appropriate method of translation. Should this be a literal translation? Should this be a free translation? Two, to evaluate the process and the partial results obtained in relation to the final purpose. So we evaluate the process and the results that we have obtained as we execute the translation process step by step in relation to the wider framework of the aim or purpose of the translation, which, on a side note, we will refer to as the scopus of the translation, following Hans Vermeer and Christian Lenord and other functionalists. Three, this strategic subcompetence allows the translator to activate different subcompetencies and compensate for any shortcomings that we may have in them. So they allow us to compensate as we go, as we proceed in the translation process when we find gaps in other competencies. And finally, so this strategic competence links all the competencies together. As you can see, all the arrows, some of the arrows of the four main competencies converge to the strategic competence box in the picture there of the model. And finally, this strategic competence allows us to identify translation problems and apply procedures to solve them. So we identify problems and we solve them with this very important strategic competence. Let's move along. We have these instrumentals of competence, as they call it. These instrumentals of competence is also procedural knowledge, predominantly for Amparo Talarabir and the other members of the PACTE group. And it has to do with the use of documentation resources. How do we use dictionaries? How do we use encyclopedias? How do we use internet resources like search engines or electronic corpora, collections of texts? How do we use parallel texts? Reference materials as such. How do we use applied technologies like CAT tools, computer-assisted translation, or machine translation tools? All the resources that we have at our disposal as translators, how do we make the better use of these resources, and how do we learn to use them effectively? This is called instrumental competence. Knowledge of translation. This has to do with, this is kind of, to a certain degree, the meta knowledge of translation, the awareness that translators have on the process. So they refer to this as a declarative knowledge as well, and it's also implicit and explicit for the PACTE group. What knowledge do we know? What do we know about what translation is as such, and aspects, as they say, and I quote, aspects of the profession. What elements does knowledge of translation competence include? For instance, 1. Knowledge about translation functions. What are translation units? What are the processes required for translation? What methods and procedures can we use? Strategies or techniques? What types of problems are we bound to find as translation experts? What knowledge is required for us when it comes to the when it comes to developing a career as a translator? What fees can I charge? How are translations built? How do you approach target audiences? How does the work market work? How can I better engage in a career as a translator? So all this knowledge about the profession is what they call knowledge of translation. And finally, we have the psychophysiological components. These psychophysiological components are essential for the development of translation. They have to do with cognitive and attitudes, and also psychomotor mechanisms, as they call them. For instance, what cognitive abilities are needed for translation? Memory, perception, attention and emotion. Number 2, what aspects of attitude or attitudinal aspects are required, like intellectual curiosity, perseverance, persistence, rigor, critical spirit, knowledge about and confidence of one's own abilities. So all these attributes, like creativity, which is really interesting that they mention creativity as a third component of the psychophysiological competence. As we work with the messages of others, what degrees of creativity are involved? Logical reasoning, analysis, synthesis. So all these are important components of the psychophysiological subcompetence of translation. So we can see this is the model, and all the subcompetences as they themselves, the PACTE group, described them and updated them in 2003. This is the latest iteration or the latest version of the model. It was reworked, revamped, and fine-tuned from the previous incarnations of the model. So let's do some matching. Let's see if we can remember the different, the 5 subcompetences and the definitions of these subcompetences. So the next slide is going to show you, as you can see, a table. On your left hand column, you will see with numbers the 5 subcompetences: bilingual, extralinguistic, knowledge of translations of competence, instrumental and strategic. And on your right, with letters, you will see different definitions that you need to match. They're scrambled, they're not ordered, and you need to match them. So you need to match numbers and letters. So hit the pause button and spend some time linking the definitions with letters to the right with the appropriate relevant subcompetences to the left. Hit the pause button and let's see how you do with your matching. Good. So now that you have some time to match, let's have a look at the key. So bilingual subcompetence. We have procedural knowledge related to the use of documentation resources and information and communication technologies applied to translation. That's A. Then we have declarative knowledge, both implicit and explicit, about what translation is and aspects of the profession. And then we also have C, procedural knowledge to guarantee the efficiency of the translation process and solve problems encountered. D, procedural knowledge required to communicate in two languages, including the specific ability of controlling interference when switching between the two languages. And finally, E, declarative knowledge about the world in general and specific areas. So if we were to match bilingual subcompetence, I hope you found that this was D, procedural knowledge required to communicate in two languages, including the specific ability of controlling interference when switching between the two. This is an ability that bilinguals do have. They call it natural translation. Any bilingual has a basic ability when it comes to communicating in two languages, from one language to the next, from the source language to the target language. But it is the interconnection with the other four which makes up the difference between what a professional translator does and what any bilingual could do impromptu when called upon to translate or interpret. Extra-linguistic subcompetence. Yes, we have E. This is declarative knowledge, according to the PACTA group, about the world in general and specific areas of branches of specialization or knowledge that are required of the translator. We need to know about languages, but also translators need to know about the topics being discussed in those languages. Otherwise, there will be no understanding and therefore no possibility of engaging in a successful translation situation or translation process. Number 3, knowledge of translation competence. I hope you were able to identify that with B, or to link it with B, declarative knowledge, both implicit and explicit, about what translation is and aspects of the profession. We need to know about the profession. We need to know what it takes to become a translator and to operate in the translation market. Finally, we have the final 2, 4, and 5, instrumentals of competence. That's A, procedural knowledge related to the use of documentation resources and information and communication technologies applied to translation. All the tools, the translator toolkit, as we could call it, how to use those instruments, those resources in our daily work. And finally, the strategic competence. This allows us to see, this is procedural knowledge, allows us to be efficient in the translation process, identify problems and solve the problems that we encounter as translators. Excellent. So this was the matching exercise, and let's have a look at the contents of each subcompetence.